I extend a very warm welcome to all the honorable dignitaries, distinguished guests, eminent speakers and panelists, strategic security analysts, armed forces officers, academia, and professionals from media, that is TV and print, to this thought-provoking one-day seminar on an evolutionary concept, the new EU. This EU does not stand for European Union, but it stands for Eastern Union, the union of nations in the Eastern Hemisphere, the region in Eastern Hemisphere. It's a brave new world, and it would usher in a new economic world order. My special greetings to the Honorable Governor of West Bengal, Sri Jagdeep Dhankar, Mrs. Sudeshna Dhankar, Sri Sanjay Baru, and President of Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Sri B.B. Chatterjee. Unfortunately, our patron of CNSK, former Chief of the Army Staff General Shankar Rai Chaudhary, is not well to attend this event today. We feel very privileged that the Honorable Governor has kindly consented to deliver the inaugural address this morning. I, on behalf of everybody present here, would like to thank him for his gracious presence, and he has made it possible despite his demanding and challenging schedule. Let me briefly highlight the landmarks and milestones in the illustrious career of our Honorable Governor. He is one of the best known legal practitioners in India. He was the senior advocate of Rajasthan state since 1990, till he became the governor of West Bengal in July 2019, that is last year. A brilliant student throughout, he is an alumnus of Sainik School, Chittorgarh, Rajasthan. He graduated with honors in physics before studying law. He practiced in the Supreme Court since 1990, and his focus area was coal, steel, mines, and international commercial arbitration. He has been an MLA in Rajasthan Assembly and a member of Parliament Lok Sabha, elected from Rajasthan. He served as the Minister of State at the center as well. A sports enthusiast, he has been the president of Rajasthan Olympic Association as well as Rajasthan Tennis Association. He takes keen interest in cooperative movement, agriculture, and fine arts. A versatile personality and a popular leader indeed. We are very proud to have Honorable Jagdeep Dhankar amongst us today. The contours of the new economic world order is emerging very clearly. The strategic center of gravity of the world has shifted to Asia imperceptibly, not only in terms of military power, balancing and rebalancing of such power, but also in terms of shift in the economic power. Most of the hubs of economic activities are in Asia today. China, South Korea, Japan, India, Indonesia. Some of these nations are already economic giants, and some are in the making. And these economies of these countries are growing rapidly. These nations will definitely displace the Western developed economies sooner than later. The process is moving rapidly, as I mentioned, like a bullet train, fast and impressive. The region has tremendous natural resources as well as human resources. If the dynamics of the region can be managed through synergies amongst the nations in this Eastern Hemisphere, avoiding conflicts and confrontation, and instead promoting competition and cooperation, the new Eastern Union will emerge as a viable geostrategic, geoeconomic, and geopolitical entity. The Eastern Union then will be able to leverage its strengths to play a dominant role in charting the course in world affairs. Thank you. Jai Hind. I'll now request the Honorable Governor Sri Jagdeep Dhankar and Mrs. Sudeshna Dhankar to kindly light the lamp to inaugurate the seminar. I'll also request the other dignitaries and the dais to be part of this ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now request the Honorable Governor, Sri Jagdeep Dhankar, to address the audience.
Very good morning to all of you. I take it as a great privilege, a moment never to forget, that in the city of joy, as the first governor of the state born in independent India, I am in a group that is far more knowledgeable than I am. You have indeed bestowed a great honor on me to be here on this occasion and to deliver my address. Honorable Air Chief Marshal Arup Rahaji, a man of enormous talent, I have felt at home in the state of West Bengal also because of many wholesome interactions with him. Sri B.B. Chatterjee, a distinguished person representing iconic chamber that has a great history and has contributed in a momentous manner. Sri Anirudh Lahiri, playing a very significant role in the present deliberations, and I have been an eklavya of Dr. Sanjay Baru for many years. There are many friends in media who have been trained by him. He has been their mentor, and I am privileged to take them as my friends. Distinguished guests, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, and friends from the media. Before I come to the subject, I am sure everyone in the state of West Bengal who looks for return of the golden era, the golden days, would take this development as a major milestone, a significant one. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Center for East and Northeast Regional Studies, Kolkata, CNRSK, and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry for inviting me for today's event, the Economic Summit 2020. I am told that the Economic Summit is a signature event organized by CNRSK and the Chamber. Its third edition today will offer a forum to deliberate upon the significant idea of forming the new EU and Eastern Union, an alliance of countries that form an integral part of the Indo-Pacific region. The name itself indicates the potential it has and wholesome consequences it can generate. We are privileged to have with us Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha, President Senerske, and Honorary Chairman, Strategic Initiative Committee of the Chamber, Mr. B.B. Chatterjee, President of the Chamber, Mr. Anuruddha Lahiri, Vice President Senerske, and former President of this very distinguished chamber, and well-known, well-acclaimed, well-recognized, and who has earned his slot by his hard work and accomplishments, Mr. Sanjay Baru, writer, policy analyst, and very rightly, keynote speaker for today's summit. Talking about EU, Eastern Union, it is a concept that captures the shift of power and influence from West to the East, a dream we all have cherished for long. Viewed through the prism of economic potentialities, and they are enormous, as the markets in the mature economies hurtle towards saturation, a situation we all are faced with at the moment. The focus is now rightly on opening new markets in a fast developing and emerging economy of the region. I, for one, firmly believe that the market on offer is massive and the purchasing power in this region is a magnet for companies to firm up integration models. Many in the world have reflected on this potential with envy and with expectation as also participation. There is no doubt in the fact that Asia is all set to be the new global growth center. Our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has spoken about it at old world fora and also in the United States. So South Asia must integrate in order to be part of this new dynamism, integrate its capital markets, labor markets, transport, and other infrastructure. I must take advantage of the new emerging opportunities for cooperation with West Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, alongside keeping in mind the challenges of Asia-Oceania, Asia-Pacific, and Indo-Pacific economy at this point. There is a need for integration amongst these countries, and that is widely felt. It is projected that the proposed EU shall fulfill this purpose because of its ability, competence to explore the market and its potentialities. Thus, the primary objective should be to evaluate the quintessential values, issues of the Union, political, economic, and social, and deliberate on their consequences vis-a-vis the people, the human resource. Also, the proposed EU should spotlight and steer the relationships between governments and the dynamics of multilateralism that this region is witnessing through several trade and economic agreements and treaties. We have seen many taking place in last 5-6 years. Since the government's focus is firmly on trade with both tariff and non-tariff barriers being reduced. Therefore, it is time to look at the emergent contours for new economic world order, the Eastern Union. Ladies and gentlemen, on 30th of July, I ceased to be a senior advocate. But one of the most significant cases, I had the occasion to put forth my point of view before the Honorable Supreme Court, before a 9-judge bench, concerned this. That was in relation to entry tax, but idea was exactly what I have just indicated, the barriers. The frictionless movement of people across borders in the envisioned Eastern Union would help induce and accelerate the efficiency of exchange and create an atmosphere of empathy that's vital and essential for the eminence of the emerging EU. The EU will drive forward regional security of the countries and will also delve into the interconnected diplomacy factors of the participating nations. I have personally held for a long time such kind of interactive sessions lead to very significant diplomatic moves, initiatives, and conclusions. Trade and industry is a great facilitator in such kind of a situation, and that will be good for the region in long term and contribute to the stability of the region and the world as such. The eastern and southeastern part of the globe is witnessing the world's largest regional trading group being formed, accounting for over 40% of global population, over 32% of global economy, and over 29% of global trade. We all look forward to a situation that it can be more rationally in consonance with the population part of it. This is known as Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which involves the entire Southeast Asia, East Asia, East Oceania, covering 16 countries, including ours. After more than 6 years of negotiations, more than a dozen countries in Asia Pacific are now aiming to sign what would be the world's largest trade agreement in 2020. I am of the view that the deliberations at this summit assume great significance, as this will bring to light the immense impact on production, consumptions, livelihoods, market access, and of course, people-to-people connect in this region as an entirety. I have personally known, after being a member of International Court of Arbitration at Paris, an outfit associated with International Chamber of Commerce, people-to-people one of the most significant pivotal statements made by Prime Minister Modi when he assumed office in 2014 was, "Look east, act east," and he has acted in that direction in a manner. He is now looking up and catching up with the rest of the country in infrastructure, connectivity, and other related issues. I strongly hope, and I'm sure about it, given the talent of the people present here, given the direction we are getting, that today's deliberations shall be inspirational, motivational, directional, and would provide meaningful takeaways as we reach towards the conclusion. I would conclude by saying that in the entire country, there could be no more eminently suited place for such deliberations as the City of Joy, Kolkata. And the greatest benefit that will accrue to the entire region. But the focal center, I am very optimistic, would be City of Joy, that would see its golden period being brought back. Jai Hind.
May I now request Mr. B.B. Chatterjee, the President of the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to present a vote of thanks to the Honorable Governor of West Bengal, Mr. Dhankar.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry is delighted to present today's program with Senos K. We thank Senos K for this partnership. Our sincere thanks to His Excellency Jagdeep Dhankar, Honorable Governor of West Bengal, for inaugurating the program, sir. We also express our gratitude to keynote speaker, Mr. Sanjay Baru, and today's thought leader, Dr. Rajat M. Nag. Today's program, ladies and gentlemen, is being graced by luminaries from the field of diplomacy, business, politics, and security experts. Our sincere thanks to the speakers in all the sessions, the delegates present here this morning, and our friends from the media, with whom we look forward to reaching out to a much wider audience. The Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as some of you may be aware, is one of the oldest institutions of its kind, tracing its origin to 1833. The Chamber has played a pioneering role as a helmsman steering the evolution of commerce and industry in India. The Chamber reviewed and commented upon some of the most critical legislations on the country. The Bengal Chamber believes that it is our mandate to connect the members and stakeholders with newer ideas and concepts. Eastern Union is one such movement which has the potential to strengthen the market in the Indo-Pacific region, integrating the areas that combine the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and the land masses that surround them. Its geographical expanse is still undefined, but it is set to range from the coast of East Africa across the Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific, including countries like Japan and Australia. We believe that we will have thought-provoking and brainstorming sessions today. We will witness discussion and debate on existing collaborations, relationships between governments, and the dynamics of multilateralism that the said region is witnessing through several trade agreements and treaties. Viewed through the prism of economic potentialities, if the markets in the mature economies move towards saturation, the focus is now on opening up of new markets in a fast developing and emerging economy of the region. In the coming years, this movement is bound to gain momentum in terms of advocacy and appeal across the globe. given the positional and the structural challenges of Asia-Oceania, Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific economy at this point, there is need for integration among these countries, which is hoped to be fulfilled by the efforts of the Eastern Union. Before I conclude, I would also like to thank our valued sponsors, without whose generous support we could not have mounted such a program. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
May I request Air Chief Marshal Arup Rahat to please present a small memento to the Honorable Governor. May I now invite BB. May I now invite the Chamber President, Mr. BB Chatterjee, to please present a memento to Srimati Sudesh Dhankar. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to please remain seated till the Honorable Governor exits. So, ladies and gentlemen, I take your permission to sort of kick off the next part of the program. First of all, a very good morning to you again, and let me add my own word of welcome to the third edition of the Economic Summit. My job, ladies and gentlemen, this morning is not to get into discussions or deliberations on the subject of NEU. That is awaited. My task is to merely recapitulate the concept of this seminar and tell you how the discussions have been architectured. I realize that the papers have already been circulated, so do pardon the repetition to some of you. The new Eastern Union, or the new EU, envisages an economic bloc of over 30 countries, not counting the US, Canada, or any of the LATAM countries in what is now known as the Indo-Pacific region. Or in other words, the development of an inclusive platform of countries constituting 44% of the world's surface area. Now, from the very early days of the oil discovery in America, when the world witnessed the coalescence of oil-producing countries in the Americas to form a trade bloc, there have been several other initiatives: OPEC, NAFTA, SAARC, ASEAN, the European Union, and these are only a few examples. Nations with commonality of economic interests collaborating to form trade blocs to gain and leverage scale is not new. What is new and unique about this concept is the sheer size, magnitude, and the gigantic share of world trade that this union of Asian nations or Indo-Pacific nations might command. So, ladies and gentlemen, the objective of this conference is to seek validation of the idea of an economic bloc which could potentially be the largest trading group in the world, accounting for, as I said earlier, 44% of the world's surface area, encompassing just under 48% of the world's population and 45% of global trade. Now, I must share with you that these figures may not tally with the figures that you may have come across in different articles in the media and people and conferences and so on and so forth. The difference is because of the inclusion or exclusion of some of the countries. For example, as I told you, my figures do not take into account the west coast of United States, Canada, or any of the LATAM countries, which technically should be a part of the Indo-Pacific region. There are also figures which does not take into account China, right? But I have taken my figures, which I found to be the most acceptable, and research from Shantanu Nandan Sharma's Economic Times article of November 10th, 2019, with the title Following RCEP. That's following the RCEP, the conference in Thailand. Now, I believe that the learned panelists will share their immense knowledge and expertise to discuss whether the countries in the region could create the required cohesion to realize the many synergies that do exist in an effort to crystallize this thought or concept. It is expected that the key players in business, economy, and strategic domains in the panels today will be able to create a platform to effect this change of tectonic proportions, may I say, catapulting the participating countries to the fastest growing region in the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the discussions and deliberations have been structured around four main planks. Number one, the politics of the new EU. Two, exploring the markets and its potentialities. Three, diplomacy as the driving force of the new EU, and lastly, regional security centered around information security, cyber security, economic security, and perhaps some form of territorial security, which experts have told me that they believe is critical to the successful functioning of any union of this nature. We hope that the panelists in each of the sessions will engage in discussions and debate the existing collaborations, relationships within the governments of the countries in this region, and the dynamics of multilateralism to identify the bottlenecks and ways to work around them and explore the possibilities of creating a common economic forum for economic power transformation to take place in Asia, or I should say, in the region. The topic, ladies and gentlemen, synthesizes the focus of CNSK as a premier think tank engaged in research of the geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic drivers for the disruptive development of the northeastern part of the country, actually the eastern and the northeastern part of the country, and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry's outreach activities for economic integration of Southeast Asia, East and Asia Oceanic regions of the world. So it is totally in keeping with, is aligned to the two major objectives of the two organizations. Over the years, since its inception, the geographic footprint of CNSK has transcended the national boundaries, reaching out to its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region to seek out synergies, and methods to exploit them would be all-inclusive, where India as a whole and the northeastern states of India in particular will no doubt be major beneficiaries. And before I conclude, I would like to share with you some thoughts or some key issues that I believe must be kept in mind during the deliberations, as I think these may have a deep impact on the outcome or the conclusion that we arrive at today. These issues are, if I may enumerate one by one, the first is the development of India's foreign policy, and which is in its current stage seeks to establish itself as a major power in the international stage. This, I must say, is an initiative which we see of late. It's a recent initiative. From a geopolitical standpoint, India is trying to cope with an increasingly assertive China by strengthening its bilateral relations with Russia in Eurasia, US and Japan in the Indo-Pacific regions. In the light of India's evolving policy of partnership from look east to act east to act Indo-Pacific now, the most recent development being India opting out of the RCEP, which you must have all heard about, makes the deliberations more relevant and significant at this juncture. Because if you want to act east or act Indo-Pacific, then are we saying that we have changed our policy as India changes policy? And this is, I think, something that needs a bit of deliberation to bring in greater clarity. The second thought is that although India and China have free trade pacts with ASEAN countries, they do not have an agreement with each other. There is anxiety in India that lowering tariffs on Chinese goods will only increase its burgeoning trade deficit. The Indian authorities are also worried about food commodities and milk from Australia and New Zealand flooding the domestic market, which would be detrimental to the interest of the Indian farmers. Third, the rapid emergence of China and the relative decline of US influence appears to be leading to a major change in the equations in Asia. Fourth, to quote the November 9th, 2019 issue of The Economist, which many of you read, and I quote, Asia's trade negotiations seem to have settled down to accept that they can no longer wait for a protectionist India. I've quoted. The fifth point that I want to flag is that the current partnerships do not provide for environmental, labor, and state-owned enterprises that America insisted be included in a rival agreement, which you also may have heard about, where US interest is now waning, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trans-Pacific Partnership, which not only did not include China, but also seems to have lost, at this point in time, lost edge or have lost US interest. And the last point that I want to leave with you before the deliberations begin is that behind the facade of a phase one deal that trims tariffs and obliges China to buy more of farm products from the US, a long and bitter trade war between America and China looms large, which may put in peril the world's most important relationship thus far. To quote an article again in The Economist, the planet's biggest breakup is underway. It will reshape the world economy and cost a fortune. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this brief contextual recap, let the program begin. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Shri Aniruddha Lahiri, the architect of this economic summit, has already set the agenda of the seminar this morning. He has informed us that besides the opening session, there will be two standalone sessions, one in the beginning and one at the end of the seminar, and in between we'll have three panel discussions. We'll have nearly 25 esteemed, eminent speakers participating in these 5 sessions. The opening session will end with the keynote address by Sri Sanjay Baru, a famous writer and a policy analyst. He had been the media advisor to the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and we all know the famous movie, The Accidental Prime Minister, is based on his book on the subject. Session 1 deals with politics of the new EU. We'll have 5 speakers, followed by panel 1 on economics. 5 esteemed speakers will participate. Panel 2, of course, will have 5 speakers again, but this is dealing with diplomacy as a driving force, wherein we'll have several diplomats giving their opinions, and they come from all across the world. Panel 3 will discuss regional security issues. We have 5 distinguished speakers in this panel as well. The last session would be standalone session on thought leadership for the new Eastern Union. We'll have two eminent speakers, and the seminar will be ending with the concluding remarks by Brigadier N.S. Mukherjee of SENAS-K. Now, I would like to mention a few points over and above what Mr. Aniruddha Lahiri has mentioned. There are two areas which I think all of us are interested to know, and I'm sure the esteemed panelists and speakers will deliberate in detail in subsequent sessions. First is conflicts, confrontations, challenges in the region. And second area is the areas of congruence, cooperation, strengths, and synergies. In the first case, that is about conflicts, confrontations, challenges in the region, there are several issues which I just want to mention. I'm sure this will be deliberated upon by the speakers. First, the rise of China is hegemonic behavior, assertiveness bordering on aggressiveness, non-acceptance of UNCLOS tribunal verdict. UNCLOS stands for United Nations Convention on the Laws of Seas, as well as disdain it has for international conventions, rules, etc. The second issue would be historical animosity that existed in the past and that still exists amongst the nations in this region, only some nations especially, Japan and China, Japan and Korea, as well as turbulence in the East China Sea and South China Seas, wherein there are conflicting claims on island territories in this vast ocean. There, I would say, reclamation and militarization, then enforcement of the self-proclaimed 9-dash line in the seas, and air defense identification zone in the airspaces in this region has only increased the apprehension of the littoral nations of this area and is definitely going to be a destabilizing factor. Third, influence of the US in the region. It was mentioned by Mr. Lahiri that there is gradual waning of its power. What would be the impact in the region? And fourth is the challenges arising out of US trade policy, especially with China, and its impact in the region. And the other issue that I'm sure the panelists will deliberate upon, the areas of congruence, cooperation, strengths, and synergies. I'll just mention a few. First, population. The population in the Eastern Union, in this region, is going to be nearly 50% of the world. The large number of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled human resources in this region. The beneficial effect of the mix of population that we have in terms of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled population would be in terms of low labor costs, low cost of production, enhanced productivity, hence its increased competitiveness. Second is connectivity. Without connectivity, trade and commerce cannot take place in the right way, and nor the economies grow. So we have large seas in this region, sea lanes of communications, SLOCs, have a number of strategic choke points, Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, as well as the Strait of Hormuz. These are the choke points whose control would determine how the trade would progress. Then we have a lot of initiatives by China for improving connectivity. Of course, we can give whatever intention it has behind it, but definitely the Belt and Road Initiative of China, the initiatives by India, Japan, and other nations in the region would be having an impact on the connectivity overall in the region. Third point is international discourse. The Asian nations have convergence of interest in certain areas and issues like climate change, environmental degradation, and trade. I'm sure the nations in Eastern Union would be able to leverage their strengths to address the concerns vis-a-vis the developed Western world nations because they have a stranglehold on financial institutions, economic institutions, trade, etc. So that must change. Fourth, the European Union template. We all know that the First and the Second World Wars are fought mainly in Europe. Entire Europe was devastated, ruined to the ground, razed to the ground, but they rose like the ashes from the ashes, like the phoenix. And today they're forgetting the animosity of the past, and now it is a free European Union where this is borderless in terms of trade and movement of human resources, goods and services. So can this template of the European Union be attempted in the new Eastern Union we are thinking of? And lastly, which is mentioned by Mr. Anirudh Lahiri, is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. What is on the table as far as the RCEP is concerned? Why did India pull out at the last moment from this arrangement? And of course, what are the changes required to meet the bottom line of India's expectations? There are many more issues which will be debated and discussed. And I can conclude by saying that we are looking forward to an excellent deliberation and interaction during the seminar on this evolutionary concept of Eastern Union, and I'm sure we'll be able to determine its feasibility. Thank you. Jai Hind. I would now invite Sri Sanjaya Baru to address the audience. Thank you.
Air Marshal Raha, distinguished members of Bengal Chamber of Commerce and the Center for Economic and for Eastern and Northeastern Regional Studies, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am truly grateful to the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Senator SK for inviting me to deliver the keynote address at this very interesting conference at an interesting time. I say interesting time because the whole issue of RCEP hangs in balance. This morning's newspapers report that the member countries of RCEP have invited India for their next meeting, hoping India would reconsider its decision, and we'll have to wait and see what that means. Clearly, the decision we take on our membership of this regional economic grouping will be an important factor in determining how serious we are about our policy of looking east and acting east, which is now as old as 3 decades. It was Prime Minister Narasimha Rao who in 1992, in a speech in Singapore, enunciated for the first time a look east policy. And 3 decades later, we are still debating whether we are ready to be part of a regional grouping or not. It's more a commentary on our domestic constraints than on international opportunities. So I'm therefore really happy that there is a serious discussion going on this subject here in Calcutta. After all, Calcutta is the center of India's original Look East policy. I'm delighted that my friend Mr. Taga is here from the Japanese consulate. We were good friends from his time in Delhi. And it is here in Kolkata that Swami Vivekananda drew attention of the people of India to Japan's tremendous achievements when he visited Japan at the end of the 19th century. Swami Vivekananda's visit was immediately followed within a few years by a visit by Mokshagundam Vishveshwaraya, one of the founders of the Mysore Chamber of Commerce. and founders of the Indian Engineers of India, Institution of Engineers of India. And Vishvesvaraya gave us the slogan, again at the turn of the century, industrialize or perish. The visits of both Swami Vivekananda and Vishvesvaraya to Japan were followed, of course, by Rabindranath Tagore's visits. And so Calcutta has played a very important role in shaping our thinking of the East, and particularly of Asia's first industrial nation. And if you read what each of them wrote, particularly what Vishvesvaraya wrote, because he was an engineer, a writer, a scholar, and someone who played a very important role in the development of infrastructure right through the first half of this century, of the last century, and into the early 50s. They were drawing attention to three important lessons of Japan for India at the turn of the century: investment in education, investment in science and technology, and investment in industrial development. 120 years ago. And the one reason why we are not today in a position to walk straight into RCEP is because we have not done enough on any of these three fronts. Yesterday on Twitter, I saw the results of an opinion poll put out by a think tank in the US. This was an opinion poll done in the ASEAN region. And the two questions were asked. The first question was, in your view, which country has the most political and strategic influence in Southeast Asia for the year 2020, earlier this year? So here are the numbers. 52% said China, 27% said United States, 2% said Japan, 1% said European Union, 0.1% said Russia, 0% said India. The second question that they were asked was, which country in the region is the most influential economic power? The first one was on strategic power for the ASEAN region. 79% said China, 8% said United States, 4% said Japan, 0 for Russia, 0.1 for India. In other words, we are not in the consciousness of the region. We can say look east, we can say act east, we can talk about Indo-Pacific, we can talk about India-ASEAN, we can talk about India-European Union. But the fact is that on the ground, we are not in the region's consciousness. How do we enter that consciousness? There is no other way in which we can enter that consciousness of the region other than becoming a bigger economic partner of the region. The game today is economics, is trade, is investment, is movement of people, business-to-business relations, people-to-people relations, tourism, trade. This is what determines how people view your country. Greater ease of travel. The fact is, we have moved quite a distance. I'm not denying that. Thanks to our Look East policy, we are more actively engaged in the region. We are members of various intergovernmental organizations. We've been a dialogue partner of ASEAN. We've been a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. We are members of the ASEAN Defense Ministers Dialogue. We have free trade agreements with ASEAN, with Japan, with Korea. And yet, despite all this, what I call G2G activity, government to government, over the last 30 years. And despite the fact that as far as people to people is concerned, more and more Indians travel east, they look east, they study in Singapore, they go to Korea, they're learning Japanese. All these numbers are showing a positive trend, and yet the impact is still marginal. And there is no other way in which you can widen this impact without greater both people to people and business to business contacts. And that is where participation in regional forums becomes important. The question then for us is, why is it that despite our intention to be part of the region, despite our participation in ASEAN, despite our reaching out to countries of the region, we are still hesitant as far as RCEP is concerned? The answer to that question is at home. My friend, who is now the finance minister of West Bengal and was my predecessor at FICCI, Amit Mitra, used to say during the days when he was Secretary General of FICCI that Indian business wants level playing field. I remember that was his favorite phrase. Level playing field was a concept he often spoke about. Despite 30 years of reform, from 1991 when Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh began the program of opening up the economy and liberalizing the economy, we are still in a situation where Indian business does not enjoy a level playing field. Our global competitiveness is still not adequate. And doing business in India, despite whatever the government of the day may say about ease of business index, etc., is not yet as easy as doing business in anywhere in this region, from the east of India. Forget Japan, forget Korea, forget Taiwan, forget Singapore. Look at Bangladesh, which is industrializing more rapidly than India. And more businessmen from India are now setting up production bases in Bangladesh. What is it that Bangladesh is doing that we are not doing? Creating an environment for business. And that goes back to those three words or three ideas that Swami Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore, and Mokshagandam Vishveshwarya came back to India and said, were Japan's lessons for the world: invest in education, invest in science and technology, industrialize your economy. How much have we invested in education? There is a simple statistic which I keep mentioning to my audiences around the country. There is no industrial nation in the world without 80% literacy, minimum literacy. It has to be above 80%. We are still not there. So you start from the bottom of the educational pyramid, from literacy. Go up the pyramid, education, school education, higher education, technical education, vocational education. We lag behind almost all the countries to our east. I've not seen the latest numbers from Bangladesh, but I've seen all the numbers from ASEAN, and of course beyond ASEAN, they're all developed industrial economies. We lag behind all of them on the education side. Science and technology. India was ahead of China when both of us became independent nations. India had a Nobel laureate in science, Sir C.V. Raman, who studied here, who worked in Calcutta. Product of education in India. China had no Nobel laureates. Even today, China does not have a Nobel laureate in the sciences. And yet, China produces more scientific papers today than India. China's investment in science and technology has been way ahead of us in the last 20, 30 years. And the number of patents that Chinese companies have been able to file compared to us. In the only sector where we still are globally more competitive than China is information technology, IT. In pharmaceuticals, we are the edge. Thanks to the patent bill that Indira Gandhi introduced in 1970s, we had a pharmaceutical industry in India before China. And today the Chinese are overtaking us in pharmaceuticals. In artificial intelligence and IT also, hardware, they're ahead of us. So the Chinese learned the lesson that Swami Vivekananda and Rabindranath Tagore and Moksha Gandham Vishweshwaraya wanted to teach us: invest in education, invest in science and technology, and industrialize. So the question has been asked in this conference. I saw the folders sent to us about RCEP and what is the future for RCEP. I believe there are two ways in which we can view RCEP. One is to see it as a threat, and the other is to see it as an opportunity. It is without doubt a challenge. It may, in fact, be for some sectors a threat because you are opening up to competition. But without opening up to competition, I do not see any other mechanism through which we can make Indian industry more competitive. We've tried everything. We've tried industrial policy. When I was a student of economics, we were all taught about industrial policy. Industrial policy is about picking winners, selecting sectors and offering them benefits, offering them incentives, adopting policies that encourage growth of particular sectors. But that strategy has, as I mentioned, it worked in pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical sector grew as a result of industrial policy, right? But we have in many ways run the course, and with the WTO, etc., and with pressure even from a friendly country like the United States, which has terminated GSP and is threatening us with Super 301 and Special 301, there are limits to what industrial policy can do. Picking winners and protecting winners and allowing winners to grow, that strategy is no longer really feasible. So competition is the only way forward. And unless Indian business scales up, unless we look at the world market as our market and exploit economies of scale, which is exactly what the Chinese did. I mean, the one lesson of Chinese industrialization is the market is not your home market, but the world market. We still pretend that the world is interested in India because of the Indian market. I keep hearing these speeches by policymakers in the government that everybody wants to come into India because of Indian market. How big is the Indian market? Today, there are markets in Southeast Asia for various commodities that are bigger than the Indian market. And companies that are relocating out of China because of the problem between the US and China, the trade war between the US and China, are going to Vietnam or Philippines or even Bangladesh, not coming to India. So I would like to argue that the entire strategy of looking east, the idea of a European Union, has to be the instrument for change in domestic policy. It's not about foreign policy. It's not about strategic policy. It's really about domestic policy. If India cannot return into the consciousness of the people of the region as an economic entity, as a strategic entity, then what are we talking about look east and act east? So the phrase I coin is think east. Before you can act east, having looked east, you can only act east if you first think east. In other words, we moved from look east to act east, but we forgot an intermediate stage, which I call think east, which is really learning from the Eastern example. And the single most important lesson from the Eastern example is invest in education. Create a skilled workforce. I start at the bottom of the industrial workforce, which is construction labor. There's a lot of construction happening around this hotel. I saw this morning from my room window. You please go to any construction site, just 1 kilometer away from here, and look at the level of skill of the ordinary construction worker. Go anywhere east of India, go to a construction site, and look at the skill and equipment of the ordinary construction worker. Forget about artificial intelligence, forget about automobile industry or pharmaceutical industry where the quality of skills required for labor are much, much higher. Start with construction. We have the most unskilled, untrained, ill-paid, uneducated construction labor, incapable of handling modern equipment. All you have to do is to go to Dubai and see how many Indians are in the construction business. Go to Gulf, Dubai, Bahrain, Riyadh, Sharjah, everywhere in that region, the entire construction industry, designers come from the West, engineers come from the West, the labor comes from India. And every one of them is skilled, trained, and highly qualified and equipped. Why is it that we are neglecting skilling of construction at the bottom of the pyramid? And then you can look right up. There is a problem of lack of investment, and I was delighted when a few years back we set up the National Skill Development Commission and Prime Minister Modi made Skill India one of his major slogans. But what is the outcome? You made a useless minister the Minister for Skill Development, and finally they got rid of him a couple of years back. But, unless we bring in talent into the policy system to create a talented workforce, which means an efficient workforce, you cannot compete with China. And unless we are in a position to compete with China, we cannot enter RCEP. And unless we enter RCEP, we cannot enter the consciousness of the people of the region. And unless we enter the consciousness of the people of the region, we cannot talk about a strategic partnership. All our navies go into the Indo-Pacific and we fly our flag. But at the end of the day, what these numbers show is that we have not entered their consciousness. We train, Mr. Raha and his Air Force train Singaporean pilots in India, here in Calcutta, at the Kalaikunda Air Base. Singapore trains its Air Force here. So we are doing certain things in order to be part of the region, but it's not adequate. It's not making the impact because a lot of this is G2G, government to government, not enough P2P, people to people, and certainly not enough B2B, business to business. And relationships today in the modern world are less and less about G2G. They are more and more about B2B and P2P. There was a time when we evaluated our relations with countries based on government-to-government relations. Russia was India's most important partner during the Cold War. Russia partnered with us in the breakup of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. And for a long time, we are tilting towards Russia in the Cold War. But as soon as the Cold War ended, and this is a book that I would like you to read. I know my other book keeps getting mentioned. That's not the book I want you all to read. Read my book on 1991. I've written a book on 1991. It's titled 1991, the year Narasimha Rao made history. And I've documented so clearly how perceptions about the world were changed within that dramatic year when the government at the time, under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, realized that what is more important for India is not G2G relations, but B2B and P2P. It's no longer government-to-government bilateral relations that determine what the countries that should be India's partners, but what requirements, what India's business requires and what the Indian people are reaching out to. And the United States became the partner. And it took about 10 years for the Indo-US nuclear deal to be done. But that whole period, there was this shift from a focus on purely government-to-government relations to business and people to people. In fact, I should mention at the Chamber of Commerce that Narasimha Rao wanted the president of FICCI that year, Harshpati, not Harshpati, Harshpati is Mr. Singhania, not Vijay, I forget his first name, who was president of FICCI at that time, 1990, to become India's ambassador to the United States. He offered a businessman the ambassadorship. If you remember, Morarji Desai had sent Nani Palkhiwala, who was from the house of Tatas, and so he was reaching out to Singhania. In other words, the focus of diplomacy had moved to business. So in this conference, let me end by saying that the focus of our discussion has to be strengthening the business-to-business relations with the region. What is it that you can do for Indian business to be more competitive and thereby more visible? If business-to-business relations between India and ASEAN, between India and East Asia are strengthened, then only would the government be under pressure to really take these relationships forward. Otherwise, it will remain Operation Malabar, some exercises in the sea, some conferences in Singapore and other capitals, and long speeches about strategic partnership. I can tell you, I've seen this business for a long time. These speeches mean nothing without the economic content, without the business content. Let me finally end by saying that please look at what is happening in the world today as far as our region is concerned. 2 months back, the Industries Minister of Russia led a delegation of 65 Russian businessmen to Pakistan. Even Russia, which is your old friend. And today, Mr. Trump has once again said he will quite happy to intervene and improve India-Pakistan relations. Now, even Pakistan is understanding the value of business. After all, the corridor through the CPEC corridor, where China has put in billions of dollars into Pakistan, they are using business as an incentive to lock in strategic relationships. We have been trying to get Pakistan blacklisted on the Financial Action Task Force FATF list. It will never happen. I can tell you. It will never happen for a simple reason that blacklisting of Pakistan on FATF will be a major disincentive for business, and business is looking for opportunities all over the region. They are looking for opportunities here, they are looking for opportunities in Bangladesh, they are looking for opportunities in Pakistan, they are looking for opportunities. And those opportunities exist, but how we take advantages of those opportunities and how we go out and invest in ASEAN will determine whether an Eastern Union will mean much to us or will simply remain on paper. Thank you very much.
It's my privilege and honor to thank Mr. Sanjay Baru for his wonderful, thought-provoking address, the keynote address this morning. Thank you, Mr. Baru. Thank you very much. I think, he provided in his address, he provided an excellent framework for introspection. I think my takeout, I'm sure that people have taken out a lot from what he said. But if I were to sort of crystallize his thoughts in one sentence, which is difficult to do, I would say that there is a long gap, a big gap between an intention of acting, of looking east and thinking east and actually acting east. And we are talking about acting Indo-Pacific. And I think we all examine these issues from the point of view of strategy, from the point of view of policies, foreign policy frameworks, economic policies, etc. But I think he pointed out that there are issues much more fundamental to a coalescence taking place between these countries. And many of them are soft issues, which we need to grapple with. So we can say that we want to act east, but is time propitious? I think this is the question which we should deliberate. In the sense that have we acquired that mindset? Have we acquired that will? But actually mindset comes before that. Are we is this the first thing we think about in the morning and the last thing we think about in the evening, if it is got to be a major initiative on our part? Or is it just a question of stating intentions and then forgetting the underpinnings of that intention, which will actually crystallize this, the thoughts and make this a reality? So there is a lot that I can go on and on, but for want of time, I'm sure that you all agree with me that he deserves a round of applause. Put your hands together, please. And Mr. Baru, I have to say that you have set the scene better than any one of us could have done through our communication, the pamphlets and concept notes and so on and so forth. So thank you very much, and thank you for being with us today. May I have the privilege and the honor again of presenting a memento to Mr. Baru, a token of our appreciation. We will begin the technical sessions right away, the discussions, panel discussions. And I will thank you for your patient hearing, and I'll hand over the floor now and the management of the event to our MC for the day. Angana, over to you.
Thank you, sir.